Hello everyone, today we talk about the Justinianean reforms with particular attention to laws, public works, even literature that was boosted by central government subsidies at some point. As we will see, there was also a great deal of repression, as you know, but this was part of the broader needs of, in fact, of an enormous empire. As you know, Justinian reconquered great part of the Western Mediterranean from the Goths and the Vandals, and we made an abundant number of videos about the reconquest proper. We will keep talking about that because it's not just an evergreen per se as an iconic topic, but also it's probably an underappreciated or an oversimplified one. And we didn't talk much about Justinian military reforms and administration for that matter, but that is also relevant because, of course, keeping this empire under control required an enormous deal of central authority that at this point the empire, especially before the Great Plague that ruined a great deal of things all over Eurasia, right, including this Byzantine reconquest program, for which objectively the Byzantines cannot be blamed, right? That's something that triggers me often, like saying, Justinian should have known better. This reconquest was doomed, right? It was too expansive. What the hell do you know, first of all? Do you have an idea of the administration of, the 6th century Roman Empire, or, what was the goal? They did what they had to do, right? And it succeeded clamorously, and what happened later was more the fruit of some contingencies that could not be foreseen, right? It's like asking us, did you foresee COVID? Like, we knew that pandemics would break, that there's some even sort of cyclicity to it. We had written books saying exactly where it would have spread, what kind of one would have been. We all knew this all along. We didn't do anything. In other, broader issues, like even politically, strategically, like the ones we're living even today. So can you actually blame the 6th century imperial administration for for having succeeded in everything, right? Except, a major crisis also due to, maybe in part also to the overspending of resources, because the same plague may have been a consequence also, a broader kind of mass impoverishment at some levels because of the expenses, the lower classes that had a weaker immunity, or the same as we'll see now, trade relations between China and Europe that are a bit less like the same exactly were intercurring in the 13th century with the opening of these great empires like the Mongol one of the Silk Road that favored the circulation of goods, of people, and also of illnesses. Still, what they were doing was the right thing, right? And things go wrong, civilizationally speaking, even when people do things right? This is something that we have to understand. Of course, you can never say, how right that was, if not considering everything that can happen, but simply as humans, we don't have that dominion over physical reality to ensure that nothing disastrous happens, right? For us not take care. And of course, there were some broader issues, in fact, that are not just connected to the expansion per se, but what also the later administration was. And Justinian worked, as we will see, also to reduce corruption. It was endemic, like pretty much in any system at the time, but still, recognizing it is a plus. So I'm actually, that I make videos that tend to restore historical credibility to, a broader interpretation of decline of the Byzantine civilization on the longer run, and there are some counter arguments to this. Surely the Justinian era was essentially the greatest one. It was celebrated even in the West later on, even when the Crusaders had sacked Constantinople already and so on. So this was a place, right, a topos of, a great late antique civilization that gave this massive, gigantic, colossal tail strike, probably overexhausted its resources in some ways, or maybe they were doing it again, the thing right, and just some contingental events that could not be foreseen ruined great part of this. We know that also politically speaking, things change very quickly, also depending on basically on single rulers, right? Aside from the plague, there was nothing really disastrous about Justinian times, except perhaps the Longobard invasion, the way Italy was administered, that objectively shows some kind of, but even just during the Gothic War, right, the substitution of Belisarius because of political intrigue, likely, and so there is always also a dark picture of the reality of rule, right? It's just that the world was pretty dark, just as today, in many ways, for these things to be part of the norm. What remains is still the massive accomplishment that should be also importantly recognized, because it kind of set some dynamics that would go on for the entire Middle Ages, and this is an important characteristic and key, in fact, to understanding the Byzantine mindset of the time, and especially the Justinianean restoration project, that this order set through the Reconquest, the reforms, etc., was aimed at establishing a perpetual order, right? They truly believed that their empire was perfect, right? That it was not just the Roman Empire, so the only one possible in the world, but that this Reconquest was a proof of absolute power. And the Byzantine mindset especially was very much influenced already, as we will see also with Greek importantly spreading culturally, linguistically, even though still the official language of the state was Latin, as properly the idea of an ideal perfection that almost hypostasized itself and maybe did seed the beginning of the decline. That, in fact, can be observed also in the way certain literary forms that were established in the Justinian era remained as the standard, as the model. Also in historiography later on, for example, we commented the Pseudo Maurice for the Strategicon, for the military history series, and we've seen that that model is the same one would have been recovered by Leo the Wise. Also, literary models of the Justinian era were repeated later on. So this was a bit like the great golden age that Constantinople was kind of remolding after a period of objective disorder, right? This is very instructively showed also by the military organization of the empire, that derived from, say, moments of kind of important instability, of federative presence, of, let's say, ambiguous control over certain areas that had also belonged to the western half of the empire, especially in the Illyricum. There was already an important demographic shortage, at least properly for or properly manpower rather than strictly lack of people, that already in the 6th century surely were, say, less available and subtractable from the economical activities that were ever more state controlled, and so the masses being brought ever under control, at least in this ever more coastal and urban core of the empire, while the continental provinces were ever more properly country-based and subjugated, and because of the fear of revolt, there were at least the central power attempted to demilitarize them, hence the need of hiring mercenaries from Constantinople. And this rivalry between the center and the periphery is also an ongoing theme. We made a video last year about Nicara revolt that shows also how difficult it was to control the city of Constantinople itself. So all this impressive set of reforms that are objectively enormous in scale and also properly in reach and actual accomplishments, right, and are aimed at essentially managing to keep together the system, to reinforcement, to stabilize it, and considering that, yes, there was a crisis in the following centuries. It was a pretty big one. Probably great part of the Byzantine resistance to these avalanches of peoples from the steppes, then the Arab invasions and so on, allowed the same empire to resist, right? And Justinian era gave to the world probably much more than we really think, and it's underestimated. It's greatly underestimated compared to other, say, not really, nor historiographically, nor in general. I mean, Justinian's times are very famous and appreciated, but by scale, we tend to reduce them. Like, there was Justinian, then there were other great emperors, and so basically, the civilizational impact was, comparable, let's say, from, with the one of, I don't know, Basil II's time, or the Komnenoi, or whatever. But this is difficult to assess, right? The reach of Roman civilization in Justinian's time was much greater than in later times, and in any case, it's probably the kind of universalistic ideology at the root of it that should be understood. Otherwise, great part of also the shades within it that definitely changed over the centuries, right? The Byzantine Empire, the time of Justinian, was not the same thing at the time, say, of Alexis the First, or even later at the time of the Palaiologoi. It was something else, and it was much closer, much less secularized and modernized than later times. And so even the inalterable character, this perpetua sanctio that was already in the mind of great lawmakers like Theodosius, that, as you know, provided Saint Justinian with the basis for the much more thorough, in fact, juridical reform of the 6th century. Still do not mean that this system was actually crystallized, right? It was much kind of tighter and monolithic in a sense than what was happening, for example, in the West. Just it spent, in fact, an enormous amount of resources trying to keep the system together without, in some instances, managing to adapt to other dynamics, including, and probably especially, not much the ones that existed out of it, but from the within, right? But this is another issue historiographically. We discussed it somewhere else. Talking about the Justinianean reforms, surely the highest point, as we have seen also in other videos about the same topic, was undoubtedly the promulgation of a law collection. And this work was integrating part of the emperor's effort aimed at consolidating the state, right? Law, justice, order, public authority is at the center of any civilization, including security, even police, control. So, as we will see, this would take also important repressive character, especially against some minorities, against certain ideologies, cultural currents, and so on. But it was still, in perspective, probably necessary. Right? It's not Justinian was a particularly repressive individual, himself. On the contrary, these rulers were exposed to the nuisances of government in ways that probably they were just to accept the necessities of coping with them, and either successfully or being overthrown in the process. But surely also we should make the effort of entering, which we can't, but let's say the mind of a 6th century Roman emperor and realizing the traumatically brutal level of autocracy that these individuals literally embodied, right, in the entire display of power. The Justinian origins were not particularly high socially, but we're still talking about a level of accomplishment that would make you, in fact, the true sole ruler of the world in many ways, and model you as such. The entire public ceremonies, as you know, the palace, even the same public wording, that those exemplify pretty powerfully such such display of force really were all aimed at properly incarnating this overwhelming imperium, right? So it's a level of glory that we cannot properly feel in the way it was felt at the time by also different parts of the community, and that we end up kind of gossiping about rather as, it's better I don't say like boom, just because we read some works of the time that unfortunately is just a very, the very few that we only have, right, sometimes, but that are eventually biased either in a an overwhelmingly positive or in an overwhelmingly negative way. In the case of Procopius, perhaps even for the same person. So even entering a bit in the literary and cultural background of the time is really important, because it's not kind of intuitive or obvious for even a person of the 21st century to understand what really a court scholar work in the Byzantine Empire would actually be. And for this, naturally, a lot of background also about late antiquity proper, and also partly also in early medieval times that kind of intertwined at this point is necessary. But anyhow, the juridical reform was naturally destined to put an end mostly to the legislative confusion that, as we've seen, reigned a bit everywhere as in any other branch of government, in the patchy type of kind of provincial aggregation at some point, even just through the Reconquest, for example, but even in the, say, originally Eastern Roman imperial administration territory really was about. The various provinces were terribly different in nature, and especially in the case of the East, were often ever more disconnected from the real centers of power, like Constantinople herself, that was, in perspective to become the only real city in the empire, right? Just Thessaloniki being fundamentally a true city, but the others contracting at some point, even starting from this time, but already at this time being slowing down, reflecting surely the autocratic and kind of concentrated kind of political institutional organization that the state had at this point. Naturally, an heterogeneous legal practice in the empire prevented especially in this hierarchically renewed order, the correct functioning of justice. The absence of an official collection of both law and jurisprudence rendered very difficult, for example, the judges or the lawyers' activity, and the only attempt to obviate to such absence had been made, as we said before, with the Codex of Theodosius II. So the Codex Theodosianus, however, collected, often in a critical fashion, the various laws of the empire, including even very old norms from several centuries before, and at the same time being acknowledged already in Theodosian time to be aimed at providing kind of only a preparatory base for a much wider work, comprehensive also of the juridical literature that at that point had not been actually ever carried out. In 528, therefore, Justinian appointed a commission of jurists entrusted with the task of collecting all the actually in force legislation and with the authority of modifying the texts themselves to adapt them to the real juridical situation, right? So the objective was creating a legal collection that would provide for properly a practical application in reality. Consider that the Eastern Roman Empire in general had remained also more the eastern provinces had remained more active commercially, urbanly, transactionally, negotially speaking, compared to the western ones that are stereotypically kind of more agricultural or more backwards in a certain sense, and in this renewed bureaucratic effort and statal, in fact, also commercial effort, etc., necessitated of an important regulation that could be applied uniformly all over the empire, by the way, right? So much that Justinian's work, as you know, would become the actual base of civil law, right? Civil law derives not from the actual Roman law of ancient times, but rather from the Justinianean adaptation that was eventually recovered in the West later on and studied and integrated with other law. And so the same Roman law originally had been more customary, like the one of the West in the Middle Ages, right? It had composed itself gradually, and only in fact in the late Roman Empire, requiring kind of a uniformation because of the increased control of the state on the community and the greater the expansion of the statal apparatus, the administrative homogeneity and so on, that derived also from, in fact, a more autocratic control, whereas before there was essentially a coexistence of different customs with a statal intervention was just ad hoc, right? A bit, again, how it would be in the Western Middle Ages, again. So this was the first step in the great reform of law that was carried out between 529 and 534 with the emanation of a central body of norms to which would be added eventually the new laws emanated by the same Justinian up to the end of his reign. And the Justinianean collection takes today the name of, famously enough, of Corpus Juris Civilis, so the body of civil law, and is articulated in 4 parts. So the first one is the Codex Justinianus, right, to distinguish it from the Theodosianus, published in 529, and in a second edition in 534, that collects the imperial laws starting from the 2nd century AD up to 534, with the changes and kind of groupings that had been rendered necessary in order, as we've seen, to adapt them to the current, to the enforced law of Justinian's times. Then the Institutiones, which is essentially a manual for studying law, with the fundamental principles of the same conceived as a didactic instrument for the students of the Byzantine universities that, as we'll see, will be founded, especially the famous law school of Beirut that still exists, but it was built in Justinian's time. The Digestum or Pandecte, that are the responsa fundamentally of the most important Roman jurists, right? Also the past that were quite authoritative. And so this is essentially collection of jurisprudence necessary for the resolution of the tribunal's controversies. Like the drafting of the Digestum began in 530 by work of a commission headed by the Juris Trebonianus, and was finished by 533 after the studying of about 2,000 works of Roman jurisprudence. Right, so just even think at the time the enormous amount of philological work, properly of collection of norms, which was drafted by 40 authors, of which in prevalent measure the writings of the 2nd and 3rd century jurists were used, right? And in particular, the work of Ulpianus, texts of Ulpianus. Then there are the novelle, or new laws, that is a collection of laws issued after the publication of the Codex. And the novelle are mostly drafted in Greek, differently from the Codex, that is prevalently Latin. And this is also the case of an index, say, of cultural change was already happening in Constantinople, in which Greek, that had always been dominating in the eastern provinces, will end up in the 7th century to become the only language in use in the empire, which is very relevant also because of this imposant, in fact, Latin, cultural, impact that, especially from a legal point of view, had overwhelmed the even the same Greek in the empire. And that Justinian, as a Roman emperor, also he who had recovered the same Rome, actually couldn't ignore and would had to maintain in his ideology as the prevalent one. 7th century, other things change. The same empire shrinks, so properly the Greek-speaking provinces would remain as the bulk of the Byzantine Empire. So at that point, keeping to write in Latin was not quite of a need anymore, unlike in the West, where fundamentally Romance speakers were the majority. And so even though the vernacular came to differ from Latin, it was still essentially deriving from Latin, and so it was easier to maintain just Latin throughout all the Middle Ages and beyond, right, until the second modern age, the language of the state in Europe, and the language of the church, of course. Justinian launched, furthermore, wide administrative reforms with the intention to solving the problem of the traditional corruption of the public apparatus, right? Corruption, people say, the Roman Empire declined because of corruption. Well, surely corruption is not a positive thing, but, the entire world worked exclusively through corruption. Like, there is not a system where, corruption did not exist, where people were not bribed, intimidated, killed, whatever, because simply before the contemporary era, there is no such thing like an absolute state, a real absolute state, not like the one of the monarchs of the ancien regime, like the one starting from the Code Napoleon, and so a state that actually becomes the only source of law, right? This was like a massive amount, again, of different peoples, customs, communities, traditions, etc., that were controlled by a central power that had essentially that rested essentially on them to rule. And so corruption was not much like just a bad habit, just in some circumstances, like it eventually was by a certain standard, but it was also kind of the only true way of governing, and it was virtually institutionalized in practice. While Justinian powers is so great that he manages to affirm a greater degree of central power, and so it was, say, possible to make much more leverage on the local communities without needing their support, and therefore also corruption was fundamentally needless and would have just equated politically to a sort of connivance with the local mob, and so driving away some important revenues that the state would have instead rather absorbed. So this was a very important way to cash in practice for the state. And if, in fact, exactly because of the enormous business existing behind it, the results were scarce, right? And it was the same bureaucrats, as you can imagine, who were more resistant to this, because, of course, Justinian used bribery himself as, again, an unavoidable system of rule, and so it was kind of almost a self-perpetuating system, and there was not much that could be done in relative terms. And very meaningful in about this was the attempt in 535 to put an end to the selling of offices that was one of the major causes of bad functioning, especially of the provincial administration that was, as you understand, even less controlled than the central one. And according to a consolidated habit, the so-called suffragium, the would-be governor, acquire, official, whatever, directly bought a public office from the same imperial treasury, and after that he essentially would compensate for this expense on the subjects, right, of the local provinces that would essentially repay him of the burden sustained for the aforementioned purchase. So in other words, the state was okay with that because, you want to be a provincial governor, okay, there are lots of people who want to be that, so the most powerful have more money and will give the state more money, right? Then we give in the province, and this guy will kind of, savagely abuse at that point, because it was not really even a way to directly control all the provinces, right? It would have required just to permanently garrison them, and with some bonds that would have been extremely expensive, because of course there were local forces there, but they obeyed to the local officials, to the local. So you could even send somebody from the center, but they would have been bribed as well if they wanted to come out of there alive, because nobody locally liked to see this kind of imposition on a system that from which they themselves benefited. So it was a very complicated affair. And of course, the most usual form of compensation of the expenses consisted in being corrupted in the exercise of especially the judiciary duties that were proper of the governors, with breaking consequences on the effectiveness of the administrative machine, because that meant basically destroying justice in the process, and so lots of people simply being abused by the most powerful and not being able to make their rights, to defend their rights, given the public administration didn't give a damn. Also consider that at this point, aside from the fact that we're talking about a nation which in the empire there are subjects, not really citizens, like in every time, everywhere, like justice, wherever it existed in some form of public administration, could be afforded only by the rich, right? The average people were under other rich people who, in this sense, controlled them, and also, from which they highly benefited, because this is the dual system, right? If you are under a powerful lord that is the one that can corrupt the official governors, yes, you can be squeezed, not too much, because that control will be used by the local guy to actually rule over an efficient system, just like the emperor was trying to do with the broader system in scale. So the main problem was not even this specifically, but was the overexpansion of single private power in the provinces in the form of a sort of, in fact, personal rule that could effectively take away most of the control from the provinces, also with pretty risky consequences, including rebellions, even revolts of the same army that was of the provincial army that could maybe make a coup even in Constantinople, and things like this. So again, it's not that they cared much about the average person, that after all probably was just benefiting from the same corrupted system. It was about the higher stability of the system, right? It was a bit the same system, there's the same problem that Justinian was facing in the control of the reconquered western provinces. The local people were not happy of seeing these essential foreigners that didn't have, what did it even mean to be a Roman at that point, in this local perspective. Like this was a foreign occupation after actually a very positive parenthesis, especially, I don't know, if you look at Ostrogothic Italy or Vandal Africa, right? They had been, especially in Italy, stable systems with the greatest actually accomplishments in Romano-Germanic coexistence, and the local support was fading in many ways, and wherever they could autonomize themselves, they would actually prefer to be under a powerful ruler that could be even opposed to the imperial one, rather than being part of this unscrupulous system at the end of the day. Because of course the reconquest had to be also repaid with some loot, with some control, right? Justinian brought back from Italy a lot of riches. There are legends about even some masterpieces of Roman, also spoils of war that were brought back at some point, to even, for example, the Jewish menorah that was captured at the time of Titus was brought allegedly back to Jerusalem by Justinian in this sense of broader universal order. It's just a legend actually, but it gives you the idea of also how much other stuff went lost because somebody appropriated itself, because of this corruption, right? So the Byzantine system was heading gradually towards a much more oligarchic system, as it would at the end of the day turn like, right? Today we don't talk properly about Byzantine society, that, as we have seen, it was also very diverse within the same empire. But let's say that the majority of people just prefer to be were unavoidably also, but they accepted that as a state to be within somebody's clientele, right? And just securing that, which was a big deal for 6th century living standards. Justinian, however, intervened in this corrupted system in 535 by abolishing the suffragium, and eventually with a series of local reforms aimed at improving the single situations connected to the bad functioning of the provincial government. So basically they renounced partly even to the same state corruption to trying to increase the central control on the same provinces. So receiving less money from the system, for which it was the same imperial treasury that received money in its coffers, by essentially depriving these individuals of their own direct power in the provinces and kind of cashing through more direct control of the same provinces that still happened in a kind of a corrupted fashion, but in theory Justinian times was kind of was reinforced by some degree, with the results that we have set, right? Were quite modest. Greater success instead within the administrative reform was the impulse given to the commercial activities towards the east, from which to Constantinople arrived the luxury products that were ever more required by these, in fact, ever more powerful aristocracies that ruled the empire. Justinian tried to, and also were important for the imperial prestige and this power display, etc., but were also just in trade balance, pretty much required by the entire system. Justinian essentially tried to open new paths to reach the eastern markets, in particular the ones of China and India. And the omnipresent problem was naturally the Persians in controlling the main routes crossing Central Asia from the Middle East. And so the attempt was always kind of going past this more convenient route that actually the land one paradoxically was, and opening, say, mostly the maritime ones were the only alternative in many ways, and so partially circumventing the problem. This was done by also establishing kind of a more mediated, let's say, trade exchange with the other empires, especially with the Chinese one. So with important delegations. And during Justinian times, famously enough, the silkworms were imported in the empire by work of two Byzantine monks, and thus it was possible to begin on kind of an industrial scale and directly from within the Mediterranean to produce silk. So eluding also Persian control in the sources of provision. Naturally, this was partly, damaging the same Chinese economy, but this is famous like some of the most important silk cultivation. Silk production began in Constantinople, in the Po Valley, starting from this time, right? And within there is a great parallelism between this era and the 13th century, this kind of opening of intercontinental routes, of kind of, knowledge exchange and so on. But within this frame of political renewal and at the same time of strengthening of the empire is located also an important public work, right, activity, public building, consisting in either defensive or monumental works. The military building was very developed through the construction or the reparation of fortified cities and of castles with the aim of rendering the borders safer and to offer also center of refuge to certain frontier populations in case of enemy incursions, which was very important not to disrupt the same areas with some kind of forced, unprepared, disorganized migration, kind of refugee flow that could also take kind of effect of violent, destructive nature. And this military works interested great part of the imperial territory on all fronts, right from the Mesopotamian borders to Italy, and today still much has remained of what was built in Justinianean times, showing properly also the material wealth of the empire. This vestige, like many things were built historically, but it's just in this moment of greater stability that really what you see is more evident. Like, I don't know, the Greeks already had aqueducts, but how many are there standing today still, right? We see just the massive Roman ones, because the Romans had much greater stability and also wealth availability. The empire, after the expansion, needed consolidation. It had won the resources, and so this massive works, very often bridges, even in this case aqueducts, in some cases were repaired, right? Also the older ones, because still the Roman infrastructure, the previous centuries was still functioning, at least in part, and even when it wasn't, it could be restored. And much of this architecture is to be found in reconquered Africa. So today's Tunisia, where a new defense system was built, destined to substitute the one partly destroyed or decayed because of the Vandal invasion, or that had just gone in ruin because of age, because there weren't enough resources to restore it. The Vandals had largely actually left untouched the same land where they had been ruling from, because would have been kind of idiotic to destroy it. But we're talking about much smaller system compared to the previous empire that had erected this important works in the same province with much greater funds available and concentrated. And as you know, Byzantine Africa that still worked in part with the previous Vandal defensive system, including the same Vandals that had been defeated but factually left, and especially in the frontier areas, to defend from the local Berbers, was also probably one in which Constantinople spent a lot of money, because in fact of this constant interland native raids that harassed Byzantine borders beyond. And in fact, some even say, why did even the Byzantines reconquer Africa? They could have left it to the Vandals. Well, the point is that Africa was really an important granary. Also, in order to invade Ostrogothic Italy, it was an excellent base, just as Sicily. And so, step by step, this, controlling it was kind of the first obvious way to control the same Italy. And the great problem of the Vandals had been, ever since they had settled in Africa, exactly that they had kind of blackmailed the Italian peninsula, because they could regulate the grain exports, like the same dynamic that existed between erratic Egypt and Constantinople. So it was kind of obvious that a direct control was needed. And after all, Byzantine presence in North Africa remained up to the Arab invasion successfully, even though the system by that point had already declined. But this broader Western Mediterranean reconquest did entail the conquest of this land. The most tangible example of the monumental public works of Justinian times is, however, and kind of unavoidably, the Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, the most important of the religious buildings edified in the capital, in fact, by work properly of Justinian and his wife Theodora. The new Hagia Sophia, destined to substitute the building that had been set on fire during the Nika revolt — I made a video about that, as I said before, you can check that — was inaugurated in 537, and it was in part rebuilt some years later, after the initial fall of the cupola, of the dome, because of an earthquake. And there were this kind of disasters also in Justinian times. In those times were considered kind of a sinister symbol, but in any case, they were built, it still stands, and it was a masterpiece of religious architecture, definitely. Even though it was damaged during the centuries, it's basically arrived up to us in the same way it was erected in Justinian's time. So it's famously enough one of the single most important buildings in the history of mankind, and we can still admire it in Constantinople. So remarkable was further the literary flourishing of the Justinianean era. Pretty remarkable was also the literary flourishing of the Justinianean age, with a wide production in different fields, reflecting the important spiritual forces of this culture that is very much peaking, let's say, the Byzantine, in fact, cultural legacy in many ways. This phase in Byzantine times is the richest one, the most flexible, the moment in which the blend between Hellenic and Roman thought reached its apex, right? If you read the Strategicon, the insightfulness from a political, strategical, ethnographic, military theoretical point of view is amazing. Also, if you have ever studied Procopius or other works of this time, you realize how insightful and complete they can be, for still within the straits of those times canons that, again, in the same Byzantine perspective, were very, very rigid, because they were mostly courtly works, so you couldn't really say anything you wanted. Of course, there is an enormity of just of popular culture, that what we call as Byzantine culture is properly just the official one, the state one. There is no such thing like something else. There is no such thing like Byzantine music that is not the official religious music, right? So there is really a divide that truly represents the superior heavenly power over the world and the masses, etc. The more Chthonic dimension. But surely, as we were saying before, there were some trends that were set, especially belonging to the scholarly branch, that would be the particular narrative genre cultivated in Constantinople up to its fall in 1453, right? With the also with the significant interruption, or say contraction, during the 7th and the 9th century that are kind of the least productive. But even after that pause, in fact, the Byzantine models, as you know, were quite traditionalist and importantly set in this point. When we say Byzantine, and I know that many of you are allergic to the term and or still have some perplexities of why I use it, but I made 3 videos at this point of multiple hours each explaining why. It's in parts, culturally speaking, exactly this point that made a lot of difference, right? It's not necessarily 1 year, 1 moment. Some say, it's Heraclius that kind of formalizes Greek as the official language. It's other passages even previously to that. Maybe it's maybe Constantine himself. But the splendor of the Justinianean civilization is properly the founding moment of what we properly identify as Byzantine, and especially in the literary models that again are also a bit the only ones that would remain, because that political social system with that kind of separation from the mass, from the unofficial, from everything that didn't belong to the court fundamentally, is set importantly here in that perpetual sanction mode that the same emperors had in mind, is universally powerful. And there is also a lot of iconography starting this time. The angelic figures were typical of the Justinian era, and symbology and propaganda. We surely make lots of other videos about Justinian times, because they really deserve credit as an era in its own kind. In fact, I created a playlist that is named exactly like that. And there is always a joke, considering this thing I just said about the sort of dark age of Byzantine literature, Greek literature, between the 7th and the 9th century. One of my Byzantine history professors at university used to say that that those who study were the classicists, the antiquists, are incredibly posh, right? And they think that their history is the single most important thing that ever happened, and all the rest does not exist, and they ridiculize anything that is not properly philological, etc. My professor was specialized instead exactly and heroically in 7th century Byzantine literature. This is basically the most depressing moment of Greek literature, but still, actually, if you understand the historical context, and it was a hell of one, it's the invasions of the Avars, the Bulgars, the Slavs, and so on. It's pretty messed up moment. And it's actually a very important mean for the understanding of those times and that mentality that becomes properly, let's say, Byzantine maybe in its enclosing character, because literally a half of the empire extensionally was severed from Constantinople. That kind of culturally Greek core land gravitating around the Aegean Sea is effectively what the empire is substantiated by, and especially the city, which is typical with the continuity from the Hellenic times, right? The Greeks did not accept the fact that they were from within, they lived within the Roman Empire. They thought they were in a universe on their own that was the polis, and so yes, there were the Romans somewhere kind of happen making things, but they thought they were isolated from all the rest. So this aspect, this mentality, this also complex of superiority, which was well deserved intellectually, but it's also a double-edged sword, is reinjected vigorously at that point in what we call as probably Byzantine culture. Most of that is already what fundamentally had been set since Justinian times, that were kind of much wider culturally, but that still had their own center properly in Constantinople, in a Greek-speaking world, and the Western provinces were just, in fact, Western provinces, peripheral ones. I mean, Justinian had to reconquer Italy because Italy is Rome, and Rome is what any Roman emperor has to control. By definition, it alone morally is worth the entire fort of the Reconquest, without any political strategical exaggeration, because it's moral forces that make everything in everything, literally. But what did these people care about Italy or Spain or Africa? They were just decentralized provinces that they didn't even see, because they had never seen them. They were just belonging to another culture, right? You call them Romans, but the actual feeling about it in the various provinces was very different, right? And this is not actually even a way of there are some people listening to these videos of mine completely misinterpreting the point. That is to say, because there is a lot of anti-Roman feeling that people that surprisingly also follow my channel probably have not really understood also anything about, considering what the content I do. That think, Rome was bad, and so the others wanted to be free. No, right? The Holy Roman Empire is a Holy Roman Empire. It could not be anything else but Rome, because Rome was the unique thing that existed in the entire universe, in the history of mankind, for everyone. And this was so deeply imbued that even people that had never been part of the Roman Empire, like the Saxons, the Franks, were eventually to be Roman emperors, running quite proudly so. The point here is that the true spirit of Romanity had been changed indeed, but part of it had remained in the West. And that's the same reason why the West eventually resumed its own empire again on the Roman basis, and why Romanity was like, what did the Franks and the Longobards begin to speak when they occupied this? They became effectively local Romance people. So that's not the point. The point is saying that empire was not recognized as the universal one anymore, because still in the most truly hardcore Roman identitary sense, if you want to rule the world, you have simply just to rule the world, not wishing for it, right? So anybody who could escape it could boast that part of that universal rule, this always maintaining for their own merit, this maintaining, of course, that still, as I often say, even 10th century Anglo-Saxon kings styled themselves not like imperatores, like basileioi, right? So like the centrality of Constantinople, as you know, also for the Varangians, the Scandinavians, the Rusians, and beyond, it was there, right? This was the empire, the Roman Empire, what it had been in the past, also the much larger one, and there was really nothing else like it, right? But still, the internal cultural shift is very radical. It's very evident, right? Whoever studies Byzantine history perfectly, or should know, or must know, that's why I made countless videos on this, the important cultural changes of properly everything from, in fact, here we're talking about literature, but the same composition of the Senate, politically, socially, what it required educationally speaking. So that simply between Rome and Constantinople, and Rome went on its own, right? That thing never ended. It was never an end of Rome, even as a city, as a center of the world, that's another thing that in the West we have to properly sculpt in our own minds, because somebody still believes that at some point Rome ended even in the West. It didn't, because Rome remained Rome, right? Through lots of other things, even through the papacy, but not only, because that's Rome before anything else. And we already said what that meant. But it was in fact Rome, was not Constantinople, right? And so this is not a cliche, this is not an oversimplification. It's on the contrary, an oversimplification to pretend just to say that it was Romanity. Because not even what, I don't know, Furius Camillus, if he existed, thought that, that it was Roman, what for Scipio was Roman, or for Caesar was Roman, for Hadrian was Roman, right? So you can imagine, considering what happened here throughout the centuries, what Constantinople could be compared to the West and other places that had been part of the empire, by the way. So we should make much more room for an interesting set of ideas that normally when we talk about this topic, nobody really, we tend to skip, because as I said also in the videos about the Eastern Roman Byzantine controversy, terminologically speaking, the reason why most people are interested in the Byzantine Empire is because of meme video game culture from the first decades of the third millennium, right? That's the only reason. It's not because they have an actual historical education or actually they understand what's the empire. To them, the Byzantine Empire is, the faction with, purple colors in video games that wears Eastern kind of aesthetical looking armor. That's what it is. When you actually ask them what that history is really about, right? Most of them do not even know that the term Eastern Roman Empire was never even an institutional or an identitary one in Constantinople, as I explained countless times. And as you understand from these videos, I'm actually pretty, I love all history, right? I don't make the history of peoples based on, let's say, what I feel about it, but I make history on the basis of what I feel about what other people see history like, which, given that I study just for a living, I think I can't correct, not again because on paper I can afford to do that, but it's because there is a broader point about a very serious mistake normally done when thinking of history, and that the majority doesn't really see. In any case, what was written properly in Justinianean times, of course, was also based on the older classical model, right? In the content, say both for the contents themselves and the topics, etc., but for the expression, so much that in many ways, of course, Byzantine culture in Justinian times was already very elitistic, right? The masses were, brought definitely under just in iconography. It may seem banal, but the books, the Bible in the pictures, normally before were open. People could read. Books in broader iconography now are closed, and they are showed like all covered encrusted in gems, precious stones, etc. Because the point there was not reading, knowledge, etc. was wealth, was power, right? In that form. But so that even the literary models were very far from spoken language, and this was already true, right? Much more egalitarian moment, like, I don't know, Cicero's Latin was surely very different from the average, shoemaker, one of the average shoemaker in the Subura. But you can imagine in a dramatically more stratified and hierarchically organized society like the Byzantine autocracy at this point, what could be just the complete, in fact, this is the point of Byzantine culture, the detachment in many ways from reality, this constant need to stick to the classic archetype. It's because they were fixated in a very Hellenic/Hellenistic way in the idea that there was a gold standard and that all the rest fundamentally did not fit that. So this eternal classicisms and anachronisms and readaptations that actually do not mean that these people were unaware of the world. On the contrary, even within this very rigid rules, panegyrics, court ritual, which you could also, by the way, say just a few, right? There was a continuous research for the new, and so this continuously stimulating the mind. But at the same time, within certain paths, within certain tracks that you could not elude from, right? And this was a problem, civilizationally speaking, on the long run. Now, speaking of the authors of the Justinian era, well, surely starting from the historians, the first place is surely occupied by Procopius of Caesarea, author of 8 books on the wars, named like this, with the description, in part also as eyewitness, of the wars, in fact, on the Persian, African, Balkan, and Italian fronts, up to 552, right? So encompassing practically almost all the Gothic War as well. To the same author belong also another work on Justinian public works and buildings, and also this so-called secret history, it's also known in other names, in which instead he criticizes violently Justinian's and Theodorus' regime. Now, first of all, I studied these things briefly at university. I can tell you that we don't even know whether he wrote that, right? We just think it's likely that, again, this works circulated in the court milieu, quite riskily so. And in general, you have, as I was saying at the beginning, either just super cool Justinian or terrible tyrant monster Justinian, right? You don't have two things in between, right? And since it's instinctive to always reason in dichotomic ways, and people are always paranoid, they must find this conspiracy theory everywhere. They want to say, oh, so Justinian was the other terrible tyrant guy, and instead we are such pure, noble people, right? And everybody was at the time as well. And so you have this obsession with tyranny, and with that you don't even know what it means, but that's a bad guy you can point the finger at. That's actually a product of properly a court milieu in which there were enormous interests at stake from both sides, and this works do not really fit really much different from what you see even in today's politics, right? Even though the context and the mechanism and also property of the literary creation were much different and actually much more culturally superior to anything that we're witnessing today, because let's be honest, you're not even you can't even attempt to pretend to be more intelligent than a person that lived 1500 years ago. But aside from that, the content is still quite revealing in all this. This problem is not, again, finding was the boogeyman. This is about reading through the lines and trying to reconstruct history. That very often is just what these works tell us, because again, that's how much the court had closed everything to the rest. That actually is provided by these works, because even a slight, different semantic difference, lexicon choice, etc., can reveal very important things about this time. Just to make an example, like the level of knowledge, because again, the public that has not read these works thinks that maybe they're comparable. Like you can't perceive the crystallization of the system through these works. There is no such thing like an open discourse, like even in the early Roman Empire. It was already something very still rigid compared to late Republican, etc. Here you see even properly the detachment. Just to make you understand, we don't even know when Spain was reconquered. Like, the south part, at least the most fertile one, the Byzantines were interested in, what would have become Andalusia, actually. But we don't know whether it was conquered before or after Italy, for example. And there are interesting historiographical debates currently to point that out, because, that's still history. That still happened. There are also vestiges. I made a video about the cultural impact of the Justinianean reconquest that talks exactly about this in the various provinces. And the chronology is also fundamental, as you understand historically. But among the other men of letters of the time, we remember Agathias of Myrina. Myrinus was a poet and historian of Justinian's wars that essentially continues Procopius' work. Then there is John Lawrence Lidus, author of a treatise on the magistracies of the Roman Empire, with important informations on the functioning of the Praetorian prefecture. Cyrillus of Pseutopolis, to which vivacious biographies of the saints of Palestine are owed, and the African Flavius Cresconius Corippus, that composed in Latin a poem to celebrate John Troglodytes, Justinian's general, by which Africa was pacified, interestingly enough. So as also the proof of the continuity, definitely, of Roman culture in Vandal times, because that was also normal. The Vandals weren't anything more or less terrible than any other ruler at the time, actually, and there is all kind of a negative bias attached to them, which is historically explainable. But again, it's not the problem of the sources of the time. The problem is people today not understanding the difference between certain things or another. There's no bad guy. A person who makes an effective propaganda is a capable person, and it speaks of a civilization. It's not the evil guy that you have to blame for things that you don't even understand. It's about you. You are the gullible one. You are the problem, because you're too weak to resist this. And Flavius also wrote a panegyric in an encomium for Justin II as well. And this is basically the last epos produced in Constantinople in Latin, this language. And that's also pretty meaningful. And also it's a useful source for the reconstruction of the court ceremony, right? Consider that Latin literature, the sense, was the product of that different cultural world that the West was becoming compared to Constantinople. So objectively, Latin literature in the West was still kind of more open in a certain sense than what the Eastern one was becoming, even though we're still within kind of courtly environment, and so pretty much influenced by that. But again, it's the last Latin work produced, last Latin epos produced in Constantinople. And still speaking of Latin historiography, drafted in a Byzantine, and so mostly Greek-dominated milieu, we find the chronicle of the Comes Marcellinus. That was a civilian functionary of Illyrian origin. So areas, also Justinian's origin was Illyrian, as you know. And Illyria was historically more Latin influenced than Greek influence at a point. So it's also quite interesting, the Danubian area. And initially this chronicle arrived up to 518, but eventually was extended up to reaching 548. And while for the branch of popular kind of historiography, naturally Greek is central, with the chronography of John Malalas that goes from the origin of the world to Justinian. And the author was a Syrian rhetor, probably from Antioch. And his work, so these were some of the still thriving cultural centers, right, in the empire, the big cities, the big provincial capitals. And Malalas' work is part of, let's say, also another literary genre that had a great fortune in Constantinople. That is the Universal Chronicle, that in this sense wants to contain, in that kind of Byzantine omnicomprehensive universal ecumenic mindset, all of the world's history, right? Starting from the very origins that, according to the widespread Alexandrine chronology, started from 5492 BC creation, and that is distinguished from the scholarly historiography for the analytic scheme, fundamentally. Some content that is more sensible to the modus particular than the great actual reconstruction of the events, so something more popular in taste, but actually destined still to kind of a more affluent class, rather. The strong factional spirit dominated by religious political questions, and also the popular lexicon in a sense, that with Malalas makes his first entrance in literature, right, in a very different way from the, historiographical and erudite, elegant one, let's say, or aulic one that was close to the courts, right, in the lexicon, in lexicon and construction. And naturally, these chronicles do exist, right? The people, especially the city communities, were in good part literate, and they were also protagonists in the local strifes. These were the eastern provinces torn by heresies, political problems that were quite often also problematic for Constantinople herself, as you know, because they always threatened rebellion. Eventually, they would be overrun by the Arabs because they simply opened the gates to them, because they were discontent of Constantinople in the first place. And so there is, of course, a popular dimension, but it becomes kind of a profane one that does not fit what properly we intend as the more properly, in fact, courtly one that we identify Byzantine culture with, right? And so these chronicles are also the product of their own times, right? This is still, again, the last great phase of late antique culture surviving in many ways. And so you still have, popular influence chronicles. But at the same time, there would be a brusque contraction for which these works will not appear in the same scale as before in the rest of Byzantine history, if not after many centuries, when also a bit more kind of the empire would start re-expanding from the same within, and so you have unavoidably chronicles, etc. But they are very different in style and tone to the Western ones, that generally speaking are developing properly with all other another tone, another level of insightfulness, and another horizon. That, if you read, I don't know, for example, the Crusade sources, they're very often. I studied Nicetas Coniates. It was also close to the court in some way, but you understand it's very stylistic, and the broader political implications of these chronicles are sometimes very obscure in a sense. We still look at Byzantine history as something more obscure to understand than whatever was happening kind of in the West at the same point. It's a bit like when you compare the Latin chronicles to the Arab ones during the Crusades. The Latin ones are insightful, lengthy, critical, etc. The Arab ones sum up things in a few words. They do not give details, etc. It's the Western thought kind of expanding, and Constantinople is a bit in between these two models at that point in by high late medieval times, and you understand that in a sense the West has already taken off, right? But by the 6th century still, this production is important, yet again displaying this closing traits that are accelerating over time as well. And in fact, again, for many centuries after, between the 7th again and the 9th, we have great difficulties to understand clearly what it is. And again, what emerges from that is much more oligarchic, aristocratic, and the middle classes will take some time to re-expand, and as you know, in the Byzantine world, they didn't have the same role, space, and relevance than in the West. In any case, this comparison is also crucial again because it's not a matter of opinion. This is just the literary thermometer. Whenever you read medieval literature, you just see that, right? If you have never tried it, just do it instead, because it's the only way to believe it. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.